In this section, we will look at the concept of the controller. But I don't want to burst anyone's bubbles here, but as you've heard me say so far, the view does a lot of things that sound like they would be done by the controller. Because traditionally controllers are an intermediary between your models and your views, and classically the controller is responsible for updating the view when the model changes and updating the model when the user interacts with their view. But a lot of JavaScript MVC frameworks depart from this classical interpretation of MVC. And Backbone's no exception. So Backbone doesn't have a real controller in the traditional sense. Typically, Backbone controller logic is stored inside of your view, and there's another concept called a router, which will help you manage your application state. So as you navigate from view to view, you can use the router to help you go forward and backwards inside of your application from view to view. And so the router actually used to be called a controller, but people found that confusing because it actually didn't do everything that a classical controller would do. So often Backbone is thought of as MV star because the controller is sort of a hybrid and it's sort of spread out among the view and the router. So instead of talking about the controller in this next section, we're actually going to be looking at the router and routes, because this is sort of half of the job that would have been done by the controller. So what I've done here is I've set up a basic Backbone router. I'm calling it app router. And I've defined 3 routes. One is if you go to the root URL and there's no hash sign after it, you're going to be going to the home screen. If you navigate and you point with your link to £add or hash add, that will then take you and call the add function, which will then add the add view. And if you go to navigate to close, that will also take you to home. So the way that you do navigating is you use these hash marks to go from place to place. Let's go take a look at router 01. So here's router 01. I've got currently 2 views. I've got one view which is my home view, and then I have on the left I've got my list view. And I've got a link here, and if you look at the URL, it has a £add at the end of it. So when I click on it, it actually will call the add route, which will then add my new view, which is this form here. And if you look up on the URL at the top, we've got our hash here for £add. And I can go in here, I can type some text in, I can click the add button, which isn't doing anything right now, so it's just taking me back to my home screen. I'll go add again, and if I click cancel, then that is actually calling the close route, which again takes me back to my home screen and refreshes my page here. So I'm keeping this super simple as an example just so we can understand how routes work. Now in router 1 you can see here's the actual method that I'm calling when I go to home. I'm actually pulling up the home view and I'm just instantiating a whole new home view, and that gets appended to my body. When I want to actually start my route, the way that I'm doing that is I'm going into the document.ready method and I'm defining a new app router. So remember before we were pointing and we were saying wine app equals new home view? Well, instead of actually calling our view directly, I'm actually creating a new instance of the app router, which then will create my home view for me. And there's a real advantage to this. I can now actually go in and var scope all of my views, so they're now local variables wrapped inside of that closure, and they're now become private. And the only way that you can get to these views is through the app router. And I also can do backbone.history.start, and this will actually keep track of my history. So if you go and use your back button, it will actually go back to the previous the previous view tracked by your router. So it helps you go forward and backwards in your application. And what I'm doing is I'm actually loading in this fragment on the right for my new wine form, which is called my add view, is what I've named it. And it's appending it to a div that I've specified in this little fragment, in this little region here. Now in the next example, we're going to look at router 02. And in this example, what I want to do is I want to add a new concept to my view, which is my events. So I can actually declare that I want to listen to a click event, to a key press event, to a touch event, and I want to target that click on an element that has an ID of add button. And when that event occurs, when it sees that the add button has been clicked, it will then call a method called add. Inside of my view, I have a new method after render. I have a method called add, and in that it gets passed an event object, and I'm calling prevent default, which will then prevent the button from submitting the form or linking to another screen. I want to actually prevent that from happening, and instead I just want to grab the value out of my form field and output that to my console log. So I'm going to go back, and I'm going to go to router example 2, and here it looks very similar to the one before. I'm going to click add wine. That updates our fragment over here, and I'm going to type in a name here, and when I click the add button, you can see down in our console that it's outputting the name of that form field. Now I also went ahead and added a key press listener, so I want to listen to when the key is pressed, and my and I'm inside of the add name. I'm inside the input field that has a class of add name, and if that happens, I want to call the enter method, which will then check to see that the enter key was pressed based on the event that's passed in. So I can look at the event.keycode, and if it's equal to 13, that's the enter button. And if that happens, then I want to call this.add. So there I'm actually going from my key press to a method, which is then calling another method inside of my view. So if I go here and I say hello backbone and I hit my enter key, it is now updating with hello backbone in the console. And now let's go to router example 3, because this is where we're actually going to put this all into practice, where we're going to create a new wine and add it to our collection. So we've defined our wines and our model, we've defined our collection, we've defined our new instance of wines. And what we're doing inside of our add method is we're calling new wine. We're creating a new variable called new wine, and we are passing in the name that comes out of that input field. And then we call wines.add, and we pass in our new wine, and then I'm setting my name input field to the value to blank. So I'm entering out my input field. So let's go back, and we'll go into router example 3. I'll click on add new wine, and I'm going to say Robert Mondavi, and I'm going to hit the add button, and you'll notice on the left side that my list view has actually been updated. Let's try that again, and my list view is getting updated. So how is that happening? The way that happens is that inside of my list view, when my list view is created, I'm passing in what collection is already been created. So I'm passing in an option called collection, and I'm setting that equal to wines. Remember, we created an instance of our collection in a variable called wines. And then I'm appending the list view, and I'm rendering it to this element that I've defined by the class span4. So that's how I'm actually passing in my collection. And then inside of my list view, I'm binding all events on that collection and saying if any changes, adds, creates, removes, any events happen to my collection, then I want you to re-render this list view. I want you to call the render method. And inside of that render method, I'm going and I'm grabbing the template, the element, the collection, assigning those to local variables. I'm emptying the unordered list inside of that span4, and I'm going ahead and I'm looping over that collection of wines and appending each wine element through that template to my unordered list. So take a minute, digest this. This is really the key piece of connection here that's happening in Backbone, where I'm passing my collection into this view, and then I'm taking that collection and I'm in the initialize method, I'm binding it all the events to say if any changes or any events happen on my collection, I want to observe that and I want to render myself. This is all the list view, listening and watching what happens to the collection and calling to re-render itself. And in that render, I'm emptying out my unordered list and then looping over and re-adding all of those to my unordered list. And there is a picture of where that's happening on the page. This is that concept of a view can be a fragment inside of your entire application. It doesn't have to be the whole page. It can simply be one little piece of your page, one fragment that you can update dynamically by observing changes in your models or collections. And that brings us back to the concept I mentioned earlier about MV star, model, view, star. And so I sort of call the view a view controller, and you can then throw the router in on top of all that, and you get essentially how Backbone does its implementation of MV star.